Hello and welcome back to Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today we're nearly 6 months into the crisis of coronavirus, and it's time to take stock of what governments have done to our civil liberties. Not just what are the restrictions and the things that we've lost along the way, but where does it leave it? Where will it leave us as we go into 2021? Will we ever get back to the freedoms that we're meant to enjoy in our democracy? We'll also be looking at some new legislation in Victoria, the much discussed Omnibus Bill, which could actually make things even worse. And we'll be talking about the role of policing in that context as well. We'll also be looking at, speaking of laws in Victoria, the amazing prospect that industrial manslaughter laws introduced by the Andrews government, similar to those that operate in Queensland and are soon to operate in Western Australia, could actually see the Premier and the head of his department be two of the first people charged under their own legislation. How bizarre would that be? So we'll be looking at that because there's more at stake than just the pandemic and civil liberties. There's all sorts of things for the future of Australia tied up with that. We'll be talking about all that, plus our usual books and culture segment. To help us do it, I have, of course, with me my co-host from RMIT University, Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Chris, good to see you, if only on Zoom. And because we are talking civil liberties today, it is my great pleasure to bring into the studio the author of many of the IPA's landmark works on civil liberties and legal rights, author of the annual Legal Rights Report, none other than Research Fellow Morgan Begg.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
Great to have you. And so, Chris, where do we start with civil liberties? Have we got any left?
Where don't we start, Scott? It is remarkable to just reflect on the sorts of civil liberties constraints that have been imposed on us over the last 6 months, that some of them just go completely unnoticed. So as I was preparing to discuss this, so there are the obvious ones, right? So in Victoria, we've had the curfew, and we should talk about that possibly. We've also had mask mandates. But it's things like the quarantine rules. Now, I actually think that the quarantine rules have probably been one of the more effective public health measures, but it has also involved mandatory locking people up for 14 days in hotel rooms under the ward of the state. So what I thought is we might just start by stepping back. Morgan, the question that I want to ask you is, so I've spent most of my career arguing in defense of civil liberties, for the expansion of civil liberties. And so much of your work at the IPA has been focused on civil liberties and rule of law issues. What do you think we've learned about civil liberties or the politics of civil liberties during this pandemic? Yeah,
good question. I think the first lesson to take is that in our institutions in particular, the support or the idea of civil liberties is built on very fragile ground, and the speed with which they were completely discarded was frankly shocking. And you could make an argument that, well, based in the earliest stages of the pandemic, the government needed to take swift action. But as the quote unquote crisis has gone on, the restrictions have actually become more obscene. And more invasive. So we've developed rules about curfews, we've developed rules about mandatory mask usage in all situations outside of your house.
When you say institutions, Morgan, what are the institutions that you normally would look to be stout defenders of civil liberties, to at least, even if, on judgment, on balance, you have to acquiesce in restrictions, but you would expect it to be a painful process and civil liberties not easily offered up. What were the institutions you would normally look to see our civil liberties defended?
Civil society groups, the community you would hope rise up in scepticism. Aside from only a few groups, including the IPA, that hasn't really occurred. Frankly, I'm romantic enough about the idea of Parliament and the institutions of democracy that I think that.
Well, you are old-fashioned.
Yeah, against obviously all observable data from recent history. That there would be enough of that tradition built in to the civil service and to Parliament and the courts, that there would be enough of that built in to stop a lot of this from happening. But that hasn't happened. It's those traditions have clearly been forgotten, and well, this is where we are now.
And this is in a context where, say, the Victorian Parliament, similar to other parliaments around the English-speaking world, we have a Charter of Rights and Liberties, I think it's called, similar to the Canadian
Rights
model.
and responsibilities, not liberties.
Rights and responsibilities. That's right, no liberties in Victoria. So in a sense, there's this formal structure. It's like, oh, well, yes, our rights are protected. Look, there's a Charter of Rights.
It's written down. It's codified.
Yeah.
But that's. I mean, arguably, that just makes it worse, because then people can just say, "Oh, look, there it is. It's all sorted. We've given it to you."
It's like when you pass pass legislation through the Commonwealth Parliament, you need to get it tested against the human rights test to see whether it's consistent with our human rights obligations. Now, all that happens is the Human Rights Committee puts up a report, and then they say, look, definitely not. I mean, this violates all this. Here's the list of human rights. And the Parliament just goes, thanks for chipping in. Yeah, no, that's great. We'll be passing this legislation. And that has been something really striking, because the Labor Party in Victoria has been traditionally very proud of the human rights legal infrastructure that it's built over the last couple of decades. So much so that they would use, I've been involved in debates about human rights legislation for some time, and you very often will hear it demonstrating how successful it's been in states like Victoria. So this is why we should have it at a Commonwealth level. This is why we should have a Bill of Rights or some human rights instrument and so forth. And the casual ease at which the government has just given up on that has been I don't know whether I'm surprised, but it's still pretty striking.
And out of that sort of the left tradition of protection of human rights, I mean, we had the notable case recently where Julian Burnside, high-profile QC and self-styled campaigner for human rights, and president of Liberty Victoria, still, I think, the organisation supposedly devoted to civil liberties, sort of a Australian equivalent of the ACLU. They went to him for a comment about the fact that the police were now setting up surveillance units around suburban parks in Melbourne to see whether people were gathering in groups of more than two, because extra closed circuit cameras, and he was like, that's okay, that seems pretty sensible. And even Liberty Victoria had to actually dissociate themselves. But it's sort of like that's the passivity we've seen, and it's only been occasional outbreaks, and as has been our want. I think The Age and The Guardian, to be fair, have called some of this out. There was, say, one story on the incredible level of fines, which I might get you to talk about in a sense. $1,600 fines. 99% of I made that number up, of fines levied, for breaching regulations around Australia have been in Victoria. Mostly, in suburbs full of disadvantaged people, for whom $1,673 is a hell of a lot of money. There were household, or parties being broken up with like $10,000, $20,000 worth of fines collectively. I remember 5 kids playing cricket in the first lockdown, all got fined $1,700. And then the government on the weekend has just put it up to $5,000. I mean, how does that fine idea even come into this, Morgan?
Yeah, that it goes to the heart of the question about the proportionality of the response. I think there's a perception that I've noticed, which is that the state of emergency, and combined with a lot of the rhetoric from the government about people who are doing otherwise normal, everyday, lawful things, but characterising that as being the wrong thing, quote unquote, which we've heard so many times before, it's definitely led to policing, which is, I would say, excessive. We've seen potential abuses of power, potentially unlawful decisions about the exercise of these emergency powers. And I think that the arbitrary setting of fines, of penalties, feeds into that loop of treating everyday normal activities as wrong, giving them a moral judgment about this being the wrong thing to do, and this feeds into policing, and it just keeps going around.
Let's take a concrete example, Morgan.
Yeah.
So let's say there's limits on how many people can gather, and the rules change all the time, and this has been different states have had these. So let's say you saw a gathering which was clearly in breach of that. I could understand why a police officer might then come along and say, you clearly breached the law. There's too many people in this group. But what we're actually seeing is police are just walking through parks, along beaches, just stopping everyone and demanding ID.
Yeah.
So, okay, there's only 2 people there. I'm going to demand your ID and find out whether you're from the same household. So there's no observable suspicion of an offence being committed. They're wearing masks, they're socially distanced from other groups. Actually, I might throw this one to Chris, because this is the great conservative argument against libertarians. You've been the subject of conservative ire on many occasions, capital C conservatives over the years, Chris. It's like, well, why would you be upset with police stopping and asking for your ID or strip and search or whatever it is? Because if you're doing nothing wrong, then it'll be okay. Why should we be concerned about transitioning to a culture in which police just can stop anyone in the street or in a park or on a beach and demand that sort of information?
Scott, I know you self-describe as a conservative, and I know that you don't think what you just said. Because the scenario you've described and the scenario that we live in is a basic affront to human dignity. The idea that it would be assumed that if you are outside walking around, it is assumed by the state that you are not doing so lawfully. That's not a liberal thing. That's not a libertarian thing. That's a human society thing. This is a non-totalitarian dictatorship thing. But there are, as you were talking, I was thinking what we have is a scenario where there's a very, very high certainty or high likelihood that you'll be caught because if you do something wrong, because the cops, certainly in a lot of areas, are so rigorous, shall we say. But at the same time, we've got these incredibly high fines. Now, in the economics of crime, they talk about 2 choices. You can either have a really low likelihood of being caught and a really high penalty, or you can have a low penalty and a high likelihood of getting caught. Right now, and most of the evidence suggests that the certainty of being caught is a greater deterrence to crime than the penalty for committing that crime. So that's where the evidence suggests. But now what we have in Victoria is you're very likely to be caught, and when you're caught, you're going to get an incredibly punishingly high fine.
Oh, yes, Chris, and on the subject of punishingly high fines, what we've seen is a pattern, actually, we've talked about before the pandemic as well, which is the tendency of authoritarian governments in Australia to constantly increase fines as almost a substitute for justice and policing. So, this has happened again. So we had these $1,700 fines. There's an outbreak of COVID-19 in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, which has come about because of extended families getting together, breaking the regulations. The government said, we're not going to charge them because we want them to come forward with their list of contacts. Okay, so we've got these outrageous fines, but we're going to be we're actually not going to use them in exactly the circumstances where presumably they might apply. But then having done that and said we're not going to apply them because we want people to come forward and we've got to build a relationship of trust in the community, and we've got brochures in community languages, and we've got community workers and social workers and all that sort of thing. A week later it's like, okay, we're going to get rid of the curfew, and we're going to come to why that happened, and we're going to do a few other things in Victoria, but we're going to increase the fine to $5,000. I mean, you go to any other country in the world, the fines are in the hundreds of dollars. So it's what is this thing about the headline value on the fine?
Yeah, there's a throughout the panic we've seen a sort of health version of law and order that seems to be working really effectively in Victoria politically for the Labor Party. But it's an analogue of conservative law and order where you can never have large enough fines, you can never have enough penalties, you can never have enough, the 2 strikes and you're out, 3 strikes and you're out systems. This is a Labor version of that in the service of public health. And they're obviously responding to the same incentive structure that conservative law and order politics is driven by, but just for a totally different thing. Now, so look, that just might be an interesting political observation, but what it does tell you is that the next time the Labor Party, or even just the left in general, argue about over-fining, argue about excessive penalties, argue about excessive police, complain about conservative law and order politics, well, they will be basking in a massive hypocrisy from what we have seen over the last 6 months. The idea that Daniel Andrews, and this ends up being a bit of a whinge, as you know, Scott, and it's hard not to whinge. And again, we're in Victoria, it's hard not to whinge about how just rubbish it is right now. But the idea that Daniel Andrews every single day stands up and lists people who've done bad things. And we found this person who was driving from Moorabbin to Pascoe Vale, and he just said he wanted a chicken sandwich, so we fined him $5,000. Just constant rolling sequence of here's all the criminals we caught.
Yeah,
why don't they march them out in front of us and we can see?
It'd be like Duterte in the Philippines, where they pull the drug lords up to the press conferences. Why doesn't Andrews just go the whole hog and bring them into the press conference?
I know. I want.
And we'll throw rocks at them.
I want to get my full 2 minutes pay.
Yeah.
And this is why John Ruscombe called it a police state 5 months ago, and everyone went, "Oh, John, that's a bit strong." Now everyone's calling it a police state because this is the thing. Everything's for the convenience of the police, and as you say, backed up by this political dynamic where it's extremely attractive for the police health state apparatus and the ALP to go down that road.
Well, let's talk about that. So the convenience of law and order. So obviously we're no longer under a curfew, which is really exciting, or would be more exciting if I was able to do anything outside the hours. Anyway, but this is this has been treated as well, they're getting rid of the curfew because the public health advice changed. Well, it's not really like that. So Morgan, why don't you explain for us the politics of a curfew?
So the curfew was introduced. The rationale, the basis for the curfew was never adequately explained, I would say, from the beginning. It was, and I think it's widely accepted now. I think actually the government actually admitted after a few days of not being able to decide who was responsible for introducing the idea of a curfew, that it was actually it was for the purpose of making the enforcement of the directions easier, and this actually exposes the idea of the curfew to massive legal problems because the emergency powers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act can only be used to issue directions which are for the purpose of reducing or eliminating a serious risk to public health in the community. That's not the purpose of why the curfew was introduced. It was for enforcement. Convenience
of enforcement.
And so, and as this, I think we've seen that the prospect of legal challenges being brought forward. We've seen
So there's a restaurateur
Yep.
on the Mornington Peninsula who has actually lodged legal action.
yes, exactly, and then lo and behold, a few days go by and the curfew's completely dropped. So I'm sure there's
But
no connection.
No connection at all with the pending legal action.
Yeah. So and so now there's no curfew is in place, and that's open book. Shut.
And we wonder how many other of the measures,
Exactly.
how many other restrictions on civil liberties, to come back to our theme for the day,
Yeah.
Also had nothing to do with health grounds.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, issuing rules about mandatory mask usage in situations where you are no prospect of encountering another person, say if you're, not within a square kilometre of another person, that raises, the fact that the direction is that broad raises questions about the lawfulness of the direction. And this actually came up on the, Premier's daily sermon on Monday.
Premier's daily chat.
Yeah. And I think it was Rachel Baxendale. Usually she's the lone voice in the press gallery in Melbourne, challenging the Premier. And she was asking a question in regards to, is it really reasonable for masks to be mandatory in situations where you're in a rural area and there's no one within a square kilometre of you? And Andrew said, that's rather esoteric. That's an esoteric question, isn't it? And I think that reveals a lot about what the Premier, what his view of the idea of law is, because that question is that's fundamental. It goes to the heart of the limits of the government's power to issue directions, the rationale, the justification for why it would impose such strict rules. But I don't think, this is just personal opinion, but I don't think the Premier sees the law. I think he sees this entire experience as power, and exercising the power to their fullest extent.
But if you, so let me let me try to make the strongest argument for the way he's thinking at the moment.
Yeah.
Because I think what he's doing is he's got a problem. He knows that we have to get rid of COVID, rightly or wrongly. That's what he knows deep in his heart. He sees the power of the state. He imposes all the laws or all the restrictions as he can that would achieve that goal as quickly as possible. And you have these pesky reporters then turning around and asking him to justify every little bit. And we know why. We know why the mask rule is everywhere, because it would be way too complicated to have it, or be way too hard to enforce if it was only when you were within 1.5 meters of someone. It's to make these things easier to enforce. Now, this goes to the myopic attitude that a lot of people have had to the pandemic, where the sole target, the sole goal has to be to eliminate the virus, in Australia at least. But that's clearly what he's thinking. And when you hand over the effective rulemaking or effective legislative power to the public health officer under a state of emergency, what else are you going to get? Like, what possible regime would we expect? We haven't handed over power to the civil liberties officer. We haven't handed power over to the good legislation committee. We handed over to the public health officials.
Yeah, who we always call health Nazis for a reason. I want to come back to Morgan's point, because remember, everyone listening, this podcast is brought to you by the IPA. If you're not already a member, join or donate. And one of the reasons why we've decided to have a podcast where we try and take topical events and go a bit deeper is for moments like this. What you just said, Morgan, I think is very, very important. The Premier's perception of what the law is, because this is what makes Liberals and Conservatives different, because we believe that the law is more than just what it says on the statute book. Many years ago, when I did a master's in law, I studied constitutions around the world, and in China, they have this wonderful contrast because the thing the Chinese fear most is anarchy. What they want is order and law. Fa, I think it is. I just butchered the pronunciation. Can't speak Mandarin. But the point is, so there's a thing called legalism in China, And legalism is seen to be this great philosophy that is at the heart of good government. What legalism means is whatever the state does, it must be backed by law. But that's it. If you want to jail 500,000 Uyghurs, that's okay, so long as there's actually a law which empowers it, because we don't want anarchy.
Yeah.
Now, this is as opposed to a natural law tradition that we are born with inalienable rights, to quote the Americans, or similar things. Mr. Chris John Locke Berg over there could probably do this
Life,
better.
liberty, and estate.
Yep, thank you. You can do this better than I can. But this is at the heart of it. This is a philosophy of the law is what I say it is.
Yeah.
And this is, by the way, I should do a nodding thing that this is not limited to Victoria. It's just where the worst example is. So the fact that at the moment Australians cannot leave, even though they have passports, just can't leave this country. I mean, it's like bloody North Korea. But yeah, this is at the heart of it. This is what I've always found so terrifying about the thing. There is no cognitive dissonance between, well, here are your rights, and I feel bad about these restrictions I'm going to put on them. There is none of that, none at all.
Yeah.
Is the choice, so is the choice if we go down the path of lockdown, is it just entangled in that we're going to have heavy civil liberties restrictions? Is once you've made the decision to eliminate the virus through a lockdown strategy, are we just inevitably going to deal with this sort of absurdity, or was there a medium path as you see it, Morgan? How do you think about that? I just wonder what you would do if you were, let's say they had a spill of Daniel Andrews right now, and you're advising the next Labor Premier not to shut down the lockdown, but just to fix it up. What would you do?
Good question. I think.
Question without notice.
Yeah. No, that's and fair enough.
See how you go.
I think I've been troubled by this. The idea that there's some kind of binary. You either do effectively nothing, or you do everything, and which
we have chosen everything.
We've chosen everything, I would say for the most part, Western countries around the world, with a few exceptions, have gone close to everything. They've definitely favoured that, and of course there was absolutely from the start. I think there was a middle path through this. We knew from the start. I remember reading reports about this from before the lockdowns were imposed here, that that the virus was most had the most serious consequences against the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. It was not impossible then to draft regulations, directions, which were effectively limited to hospitals, aged care facilities, people that were infected and people that were close contacts of people that were infected, and then to leave, and then some very, you could almost say, for the rest of the population to effectively issue guidance or alerts and warning them to exercise caution.
Yeah, and a proportion. The question, you used the word proportionate before. Proportionate measures, and also proportionately enforced.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to the Zoe Bueller experience of storming into someone's house.
Yeah,
and the Victorian Bar, by the way, pointed out that there's actually case law against you don't have to put people in handcuffs.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's right. And I've argued in the Spectator Australia that I don't, in my opinion, I don't think that a crime of incitement even occurred. I don't think the Victoria Police even raised a prima facie case that there was an offence.
We should talk about that, because it's possible that not all listeners have been following this case particularly closely. Do you want to just explain that argument in the context?
Yeah, sure. So
they've been arresting a lot of people for incitement, quote unquote.
Yeah, and I think the Victoria Police have taken a very, very broad view of what incitement actually is, and so the criminal offence of incitement is provided for in the Crimes Act, the Victorian Crimes Act, and it has two elements, effectively. It's a person has to do something, communicate an incitement, has to communicate to someone, encouraging them to commit an offence. And the second element is someone actually needs to receive that communication and then be incited to do the offence. And
it's that final phrase that's really important.
Yeah. And I don't think that Victoria Police got to that stage of determining whether someone had been incited before they arrested. It's like they've laid the arrest, they've laid charges, and now they're going to go to the stage of determining whether someone had been incited to do the offence. So that was problem number one for me. But the second problem...
Sorry, I just want to dwell on that because in the classic example of John Stuart Mill's idea about freedom of speech, it's fine to yell that a corn dealer, so a bread dealer, is starving the poor, but it's not fine to yell it in front of the corn dealer's house when there's a giant mob. And so we discussed this in freedom of speech theory, but it's also a really important caveat that it's not just you stand in front of the mob screaming that the corn dealer is starving the poor. The mob has to do something about it.
Yeah.
Like you gotta be able to lead them.
Exactly.
For the incitement.
Yeah. So Victoria Police have apparently seemingly taken the view that, well, incitement can be the offence can be affected when you simply just say something and that someone somewhere could potentially commit a crime because of it.
Yeah.
But it's actually a serious criminal offence, and that's nowhere near good enough.
There's also an element of specificity that you need in most incitement offences too. So it can't be just kill all men, right?
Yeah.
That's not incitement. Even if men are eventually killed, even if someone, it's just too general. Yeah. It's got to be like kill this specific person.
It's a high bar. There is a threshold, and
they
haven't demonstrated that threshold's been met. Now, I'll mention the second, and this is probably a more serious point, which is that in order to prove an incitement offence, a person has to be incited to commit an offence. But I think it's likely that the health directions. Breaching a health direction isn't a crime. The health directions are they're regulatory administrative rules
by mid-level bureaucrats.
Yeah, and it's important that they're not described as crimes because that would mean that the chief health officer, by his own discretion, would be able to create new crimes at his whim. That's an absurd, ahistorical.
Well, it's only absurd to us.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're otherwise in a police state, I mean, if that gets waved through by the courts, well, then we do have government by edict.
Yeah,
so what we're talking about here is sort of incitement to commit regulatory infractions.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So that would be
incitement to fill out the form incorrectly as provided for in said regulations. You know,
exactly. So can you imagine then applying that standard to all the people who say that we should fill out the census with, say that your religion is Jedi or something along those lines, or decline to answer certain questions? Again, regulatory infractions.
Mate, you're going to jail for 100 years. Speaking of people going to jail. A prospect that has people either horrified or applauding has been raised with regard to occupational health and safety and industrial manslaughter laws in Victoria. This has been an article of faith amongst the union movement and therefore the ALP to introduce laws regarding industrial manslaughter because it's not enough to have occupational health and safety laws. We must be able to jail chief executives and board directors and impose all kinds of liabilities above and beyond the usual tests of due diligence and so on. And Robert Gottliebsen, amongst others, covered this by saying that now, as we've watched the Board of Inquiry progress in Victoria, the Coate Inquiry, and we've seen the failure of the hotel quarantine, which has led to over 700 deaths, that this could well fit within the remit of the very legislation that the Labor government itself passed that rather than what they had in mind was chief executives of those evil corporations being carted off to jail for an offence under this legislation, the very first people that could be charged would be the Premier, the Secretary of the Department of Health, the Premier and Cabinet, and so on and so forth. And there's been a letter go to the Occupational Health and Safety body, the Work Cover Authority in Victoria, as you're enabled to do, to say you must look at these possible breaches. So I got to say, social media lit up when this was pointed out.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting one. So it's important for listeners to understand that these are novel laws. So they only, I believe, came into power on the 1st of July 2020. So in fact, literally, given how most of our businesses have been shut down, non-essential industries have been shut down, literally very few companies have been able to be covered by this in any real practice. We're not the only state to have industrial manslaughter laws. Some other states do. What's really interesting about this
in fact, and just to interrupt, by the way, before the last state election, we said the IPA put out a paper saying don't do it. Do not follow Queensland's lead. You know, this is terrible legislation.
Yet another lesson there.
Yeah.
But this is a particularly interesting instance of industrial manslaughter because it quite explicitly covers members of Parliament and members of the government. In fact, as it was going through Parliament late last year, the government actually said that the Premier, Ministers and Departmental Secretaries are covered by this new offence. Now, this is relevant because the council assisting the inquiry into the hotel quarantine failure has said that the failure itself was responsible for the 768 deaths that at that time had been had come off the back of this second wave. So the question for you, Morgan, is this a bit pie in the sky? Is this the sort of thing that gets us all hot under the collar but is unlikely to go anywhere, or is this a real thing?
Well, it's interesting what you said about the government actually said at the time that it applied to ministers and the departments, because I do recall that the opposition moved amendments in the Legislative Council to make that explicit within the legislation, and I believe those proposed amendments were negative, so they weren't eventually included. And so
I have a quote from Gail Tierney, the Minister for Training and Skills at the time in the Legislative Council. I may have stolen that from one of the many columnists that have been writing about it in the last 2 days. I think I may have stolen it from Janet Albrigtson's column. I hope she forgives me if she discovers that. I can't remember.
No, that's very interesting, and that's strong support for the idea that the laws do apply to the state, and that was a concern at the time, and I mean that should be a concern, that question, because we've seen in this state throughout 2020 that there's been two Victorias. We've had, the private sector, which has been completely smashed and obliterated by the shutdown and the restrictions, but the public sector has been able to effectively immunise itself from all the rules,
so to speak,
and prosper. So to speak. And so that's very interesting. I'd be very interested to see, if it reached the judicial stage, where the courts usually they should treat those parliamentary statements as having quite a heavy weight. So
they're a guide.
I must say, and this might be my own misunderstanding of the law, and I'd be happy if anyone who does have better knowledge contacted me to correct me. But my understanding of industrial manslaughter laws is that it's in situations where an employer has a duty of care to an employee, and then the employee is killed as a result. And I'm not sure if that what the people arguing for it now to be used in this way, whether that meets that definition or whether there's provisions in the Act which do extend further.
I dare say it turns on the fact that in hotel quarantine the hotels actually became workplaces under the control of the state.
Yeah, okay.
I dare say that's what. Ken Phillips, the great Ken Phillips, has been a friend of the IPA for a long time, is running this. I dare say that would be on.
And I defer to. I mean, he is an expertise in his expertise.
So why don't we ask the principal question?
Yep.
Should they be liable if that's the case? Regardless of what the legislation says, should you be holding government officials liable for casualties of their decision making?
I definitely think that there should be a right to bring a claim against the government for mismanagement of this kind, which has these kinds of consequences. The IPA's history is that we've opposed industrial manslaughter laws, and that's for good reason. The idea of vicarious criminal liability, where a director or a board member of a company would be put in jail for an action which they might not have been present for, which they might
which was done they have no knowledge which could have been done in contravention of the very policies and procedures that they'd authorised.
But that said, if we are to have these laws, then they should apply equally to the government. Yeah. I have absolutely no discomfort in saying that.
Yeah, I mean, in a policy sense, these are bad laws specifically for industrial manslaughter, and generally, I mean, I can't believe it's come to this actually, Chris, because I worked in politics 30 years ago. And people know my interests in the matter. And I don't know how many times people have said to me over the years, so-and-so should be in jail for what they did. Kevin Rudd should have been jailed for the pink bats.
Yeah,
I mean, 4 people were killed. And I always said, half in jest, good God, man, if you start jailing politicians for incompetence, the entire system will break down. But it's only half in jest. Because we meant to have mechanisms of accountability other than leaving it to courts. And it creates terrible incentives. As we've seen in this code inquiry. I mean, why is it that we've had 16 witnesses all pointing at everybody else, saying it wasn't me, don't know nothing, can't remember, don't remember that email, no, nobody told me. Well, Gottliebsen's point is because they're shit scared that they're going to go to jail. I mean, so it's almost like, this is why in South Africa they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission instead of just jailing, all the National Party figures, because it's like it creates a terrible incentive and doesn't get you anywhere. And whereas civil liability and actually gives you the opportunity for the state collectively to be punished for its actions, and they should be liable, just like. I saw a police shooting in America, $20 million liability claim for Breonna Taylor, I think it was. No, sorry, it was a different one. That's appropriate, whereas every time you say, I'm going to start charging the chief of police for anything that happens on his or her watch, you've created a terrible incentive, you've bogged the courts down, the unions get involved, it's just the whole system breaks down. But wouldn't it be ironic if this terrible law actually did put someone in jail?
Well, you can't spell manslaughter without laughter, and there'd be no small amount of humour in it.
I like the way you thought through that, Scott, because ultimately we delegate to Daniel Andrews and the rest of the Parliament to make decisions on our behalf. We've chosen to do that. And then when they make decisions, the answer is not to jail them, regardless. But the answer may well be, it's our state, it's our government. We are stakeholders in that government, and if we've delegated to someone who makes a catastrophic decision that causes real harm that can be expressed in a monetary sense through the court system, then unfortunately that's on us. We will have to pay that. That's a quite principled way of thinking. Well, yes, we should absolutely be able to sue the state for damages in that context. But personally penalising Daniel Andrews outside the ballot box, which I'm looking forward to doing, it's more interesting. It's an interesting theoretical thing. I wonder whether it's all a bit pie in the sky, but it does show you some of the absurdities that these industrial manslaughter laws can.
And we should point out too, for anyone for our WA listeners, that the point has been made that similar legislation is proceeding through the WA Parliament, but they've woken up to this issue and they've decided to exclude the public sector.
Oh, that's nice.
That's of great comfort to the people of Western Australia, I'm sure.
To know that everyone will be liable except the politicians and the public servants. So we do look forward to that. We have come to that part of the show, I think, where we talk about our books and culture picks, what we've been reading, watching and listening to. Chris Berg, would you like to lead us off?
Yeah, sure. So I watched the new Netflix movie Enola Holmes. So based on a book by Nancy Springer. Enola Holmes is the sister of Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft Holmes. And the story is that she's basically been abandoned by her brothers to live with her mother. She's much younger than her brothers. Then her mother goes missing, and thus the great mystery begins, where she's young, she's 16 or so, and she grows into become or at least demonstrates the abilities to become a great detective like her brother. The movie it's good fun. I'm not going to say it's going to win any great awards for artistic quality, but it is in this. I know in the world of Netflix these days, they've got so much data about what we want to watch, the style we want to watch it, the characters we want to see back. So they just crack them out formula by formula, and the quality ends up being fairly good. It's never interesting, but it's always fairly good. Enola Holmes,
contestable.
It's one of those. The thing I wanted to talk about though is, and
it was actually made. I see that Millie Bobby Brown is listed as one of the producers. And what is she? She's like 18, and she's already got her own production company and picking and choosing what she's going to star in. So good luck to her.
So look, it is good, and I don't want to denigrate it. I do, but the point I want to make is, so a lot of people have complained that the Sherlock played by Henry Cavill, who played Superman, doesn't really feel much like Sherlock. I agree with that, but the worst violence done to the characters is the character of Mycroft Holmes. So Mycroft Holmes is, in my view, easily the best character in the Sherlock Holmes universe, I guess. Sherlock Holmes cinematic universe, because he is smarter than his brother. He is better at solving crimes than his brother, but he couldn't be bothered, and he's interested in politics and government. So doing some research for this, and I won't claim to have read all the Sherlock Holmes books, but doing some research. So Mycroft Holmes, it's very unclear in the original Sherlock books what his actual job is. So he may be just a very senior public servant. He may be a sort of Dominic Cummings sort of advisor to the Prime Minister type thing. They're always really unclear about what he does, but he's incredibly clever. He knows where the bodies are buried. He's buried many of those bodies themselves, and he's the best character in that universe, and they treat him so poorly in this, and they make him just a smarmy, annoying brother when he's so by far the best. If you recall back the Sherlock Holmes movies that were released a few years ago, he was played by Stephen Fry. Mycroft was played by Stephen Fry, and that was genuinely good. Someone who exudes a form of intelligence and a form of connections. But anyway, so that's my whinge about that. It's still a good show. You should watch it. But they do very poorly to the best character in the world.
Fair comment. Yeah. No, it's and they didn't quite tie up the loose ends of the story, as my 15-year-old keeps pointing out. Anyway,
that is frustrating.
The quest for the mother that was supposedly the propulsive force of the plot just sort of got wrapped up in 5 minutes when she just turned up.
Look, and there's also, and this will annoy you, Morgan. There's a fair bit of, we've got to have some themes, some contemporary themes in the movie. It's kind of about suffragettes, but then there's also a race in the suffragettes subplot, and anyway, it's messy.
It breaks. I always find that breaks immersion. You can't really get into it if it keeps pulling you out. I find in those kind of movies.
Triggered.
So,
Yeah.
Triggered, yeah, must be
Should cover the
triggered.
trigger warning
Must
for
be-
conservatives.
Yeah. Well, I must be a snowflake.
I might go next because, once again, Chris, I have a book.
I'm so proud of you.
Which, oh, dang, I forgot to bring it into the studio. Wait, let's do that thing. So, this is a book by Carl Ove Knausgaard, who has written the 6-book series called My Struggle, which I've spoken about on the podcast before. But this is a book about his fellow Norwegian, the artist Edvard Munch, who everybody knows, even if they don't know that they know this, because of his iconic painting, The Scream, with the guy holding his hands to his head and generally losing his mind. It's been much shared, actually, in Victoria recently, go figure. This book is called So Much Longing in So Little Space, The Art of Edvard Munch. And Knausgaard is a great writer who admits he knows very little about art. That would go... I'm neither of those, actually. No, I'm right, yes. I'm not a great writer, and like him, I don't know much about art either. But he was called upon to curate an exhibition of Munch's works. It was a bit of a wheeze for a gallery who thought it'd be funny to put this famous Norwegian author in charge of curating these works. And because it's Knausgaard, he writes at length about how anxious this made him and how worried it was. And, you know, there's 4 pages on him getting a cup of coffee and lighting up a cigarette because that's Knausgaard. But along the way, he did go and interview some people who did know something about art and reflected on Munch, who's a very interesting guy, sort of late 19th century milieu that he came out of, and he lived long enough to see the Germans invade Norway. He's stuff like The Scream, which are almost like iconic works of modernity and anxiety and alienation, were all sort of in the earlier part of his career. And for the last 30 or 40 years, he just, sat in his studio and painted sometimes landscapes, sometimes people, but, much less stressful themes. So I learnt a lot about Munch, and through these interviews with actual true art critics and other painters, I learnt a lot more about the craft and also that whole business of modern painting. I'd never even thought about the fact that if you look at The Scream, your eyes are drawn to the head of the guy screaming, but it's actually a landscape. Like, he's actually standing on a pier, and there's water.
Yeah, he's standing on a pier.
And there's water in the background, and other people on the pier, and there's a lighthouse. I think there's a lighthouse or something, and you can go and stand on the spot where he painted it. And so it's this experience, though, of most people would go and see that pier and that water and that landscape, whereas for Munch, he lived in his own head so much. That's
existential horror in a lovely landscape environment.
That's right. And it goes into, tragically, his mother and his sister died of tuberculosis when he was still a young man. He painted those experiences. So he had the usual fill of issues. He and his fellow artists were all terrible alcoholics and so on, but he finished up getting out of all of that. And it finishes on a nice note too, that when under the German occupation, we know the term quisling for someone who collaborates with the regime was actually because of a Norwegian, Vidkun Quisling, who offered to run the government of Norway for the Nazis. So it was a gentle sort of occupation, and Munch was allowed to continue painting, and he was invited to just join a society of artists. The government was setting up because of its support for the arts, sort of like an Australia Council, but under Nazi occupation. And anyway, it was very pleasing to read that Munch told him to piss off. So he was having none of that. He was not a political operator, but he was having none of that. So good on him. So, yeah, not a book for everyone. You got to be into either Munch or Knausgaard, preferably both. But if you're just looking for something a little bit different, So Much Longing in So Little Space. Morgan.
Thanks, Scott. So my culture pick this week is a Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, and it's a it's a documentary with elements of dramatization, with narrative, which is, I don't think the format really works, but they're trying something new, I guess. So that's interesting. But it's about the design, the background of big tech and social media. So a lot of the voices in the documentary are a lot of key executives and programmers and engineers who designed a lot of the features of social media apps, and in particular how the algorithms work to maximize the monetization of those platforms, and more than that, also influence and sort of change people's behaviours in order to meet that monetization goal. And for someone, I for many years, I've stayed away from social media. So for me, it was quite informative about the background to how it actually works. And the second half of the documentary, I felt it wasn't as persuasive or interesting, because it spends maybe 20 minutes trying to say something that could have been explained in 2 minutes, which is that because of the way social media works, people can effectively construct and design their own realities, their own worldview, and because of that, it undermines our capacity as a society to have a shared set of values which binds together a single political community. And this is the point of that segment was about polarization, but it was interesting in what it said, but also interesting in what it omitted to say. So it used as an example, say, how fake news in the period of the coronavirus manifested itself in people believing in 5G tower conspiracy theories and whatnot, and that's true. But the flip side of that, which wasn't mentioned, was that how social media has been a factor in hyping up the fear of the coronavirus. That wasn't mentioned, and other issues were it accepted the premise that Russia hacked the 2016 election, but that could also be categorized as the kind of conspiracy theory that would be spread on social media platforms. Which indeed it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just.
You're not implying that Netflix is just repeating the sort of left liberal consensus.
Yeah, but I have to say, I think this was implicit. I don't ascribe any malice to the program. I thought it was interesting and I recommend it, but I just think there was some implicit bias. And I think the biggest problem though was that it left out, I think, the biggest thing. Although what it did describe was very important, but how people actually see social media now, the problems of social media, which is malevolent personalities who form networks to essentially they're the cancel culture outrage mobs to destroy people's lives, destroy careers, make people feel insecure and ill at ease, and make them question their own lives. This is synonymous with social media, but that doesn't get mentioned at all in the documentary, and that is a huge omission to me.
So I haven't watched the documentary yet, but I have read one of the core texts in that genre, which is surveillance capitalism, which I wrote about in the IP review. Scott, I am
August 2019. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Put it in the show notes.
Professor Zuboff, I think it is from Shoshana Zuboff from Harvard. Yeah, she's interviewed in the show.
As the backlash against big technology companies keeps going for now many years, I'm starting to get more sympathetic for the sort of grandiose claims that were made in the early days of social media, which is the democratization, that it represents the democratization of the media, the democratization of public and political communication. And it's just the surprise by some people who describe themselves as Democrats that democracy is messy and even sometimes very ugly when everybody gets to speak. Because the alternative, right, the thing that social media gave us was a way around the gatekeepers, the way around a very narrowly defined set of elites in the press who could go on television, who could go and write opinion columns in the newspaper, who decided that the newspaper would endorse whoever it was for prime minister or president and so forth. Social media was suddenly a reversal of that. Now, it turns out that reversing that has had some significant consequences, pro and con. It's given us, I think, enormous benefits, but it has had really significant costs. But the push against social media per se is actually a push against that democratic nature. So when people get together and talk to each other, sometimes they have unapproved ideas. Sometimes those ideas are just batshit insane. Absolutely. But it's also the case that welcome to democracy. That is what it looks like when the people get together and chat.
But I don't think the people are getting together in a sense that normal people. I don't think humans. I don't think the human psyche. I don't think our human nature is to be connected in the way that social media connects us. I think there's, and this is keeping aside all the the algorithms and monetization, which actually influences how those communications happen. But I just don't. I don't think that there's. I don't think that we're adapted to communicate in this way constantly. And I think, and there's malicious people. There are frankly psychotic people who have taken advantage of these platforms, and there's vulnerable people who have suffered from, and of course, you use these things at your own risk, and I understand those arguments. But look, to be honest, I think, and it actually, surprisingly, it went as far as to say that there needs to be restrictions on social media going up to and including total prohibition. But frankly, I think we're heading in that direction. I think it's not healthy, and I think that we're going to reach a stage where things like exemptions from liability as publishers, which platforms enjoy, those will become, regardless of the merits of the argument, they will become increasingly untenable. And I think that we're going to reach a stage where we may reach a stage where social media is treated more like a drug because of the effects that it has on people.
But I just want to spell out the alternative world there. The alternative world is the world that we had until, say, 2009, when Facebook and Twitter really gained prominence. The alternative world is where there are gatekeepers, where there are public discourse is dominated by large companies that can afford to pay the sorts of fines that you're talking about, where they speak as one rather than this incredibly messy, sometimes destructive, but fundamentally democratic system that we have.
Yeah, I'm going to actually bring this one home, Chris.
Sure.
I'm going to loop this whole show because one of the things about this is, so coming back to the social dimension and the harm that's associated with social networks, and there is a degree of harm. We certainly know, and particularly with vulnerable populations, and we're all worried about young people. 12 months ago, you would have seen many, many government agencies who were concerned about the impact of social media on young people, and all the campaigns to get off screens and be active and all this kind of thing. The nanny state was completely invested in combating the nefarious influence of social media. As soon as the Wuhan flu came in, bang, schools are closed. You're not allowed to see your friends. You're locked in your house for 23 hours a day. What the hell do they think these kids are doing?
Tell you what, I didn't have a Nintendo Switch in this household 12 months ago.
Yeah, we just bought some extra controllers for ours. Yeah, exactly. That's why there's a doctor on the front page of the Australian today talking about the epidemic of adolescent mental health crisis in bloody Victoria. It's just I'll just add that to the list of things that the nanny state and the left were always going on about being super concerned about, right up until the moment they decided they weren't concerned. They were super concerned about civil liberties until they decided they weren't. They were worried about an epidemic of loneliness until they weren't. And social media is something they were worried about until they weren't. So, well, they should all be charged with industrial manslaughter then. That's what I think, Chris.
You wrapped it up beautifully there.
Thank you very much. Keep those cards and letters coming in, guys. ipa.org.au. If you're listening on a podcast platform, this is your chance to give us a 5-star review and add some glowing comments. Anything less than that, don't worry about it. Do someone else's podcast and give them a 2-star review. But yes, you've been listening to Looking Forward, a product of the IPA. Thank you as always to my co-host Chris Berg.
No worries.
Very great thanks for coming in today, Morgan Begg.
No, thank you.
For your wonderful contribution. Thanks as always to Josh in the control room. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.